the participants to share with us their own lived experience as to whether legislation has been implemented to their expectations, and whether legislation has contributed to improvement of the quality of their lives, or whether it has complicated their lives. So the idea is that we should listen, take note, and because some of them speak without specific reference to specific sections of legislation. So it's our duty to then find relevant legislation that would need to be interpreted in terms of their inputs. So there's a common thread that is emerging. Many of them raise very sharply problems around land ownership, because historically the African communities were excluded from holding title deeds. So it seems to be a burning issue as we've been visiting all these provinces. Thank you.
There's a gentleman there.
I can hardly hear you, I must say, my brother. I think your mic is off.
Yeah, your mic is on.
It's off here. Switch it on here.
It is on.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Manda Koza, for attending. It seems as if knowledge of our legislation among people that visit, especially in Mpumalanga, are not known. Is there any way whereby public is being informed of new legislation? How are these maybe public hearing going to help them, or else towards the implementation of each law? I mean, like signing of each maybe legislation. Are people being given enough time? Specifically, some of them spoke of revisit towns and exclude townships, whereby they seem to speak, like you said, they speak of issues not quoting any legislation. That tells you that they don't know what the legislation is. They just believe it doesn't. The second one is simply you talking more of the land, in which it seems as if people are not heavy on how maybe land restitution was maybe done since 1994 up until the Republican. So what is there in place that's going to happen? We heard you guys are planning also to bring maybe the new legislation that will better deal with land.
Is there another question that we can go with from the media? Does anybody else want to ask another question? Okay, we'll go with the response then.
Well, we don't expect all of our people to be experts, in terms of understanding legislation and be in a position to refer to chapter and section of the law. That's why we rely more on their lived experience, because people interact with law when it, they, you give birth to a baby. When you have to register the baby, then you get to understand the requirements of getting the baby to be registered and so on. When someone dies, and there are regulations and legislation how to access whatever, how to deal with the estate of a deceased person. that's when people then interact directly with the law. So we really don't expect them to, to be experts. But as I said, we rely on their lived experience. There's a lady today in the plenary session who's HIV positive and was able to know her status whilst working at a farm. And she says, she got to know of her rights and protections only after she had already left the farm. She is an activist. She's now trying to highlight the plight of HIV positive farm laborers and so on. So it's that kind of input that our panel would have to find relevant legislation to check as to whether existing laws are being implemented properly, and or if there are gaps in legislation, we should be able to identify that so that the lawmakers can address those gaps.
My name is Mwendi from SABC News. I just want to check from your side as to whether this consultation process has lived up to your expectations. And maybe are there some issues that you thought maybe deserved to be raised and were not raised since you started with the process?
Well, as I explained at the beginning, we as a panel, we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We have access to Chapter 9 institution reports. We have access to portfolio committee reports. We have access to researched papers at a number of universities. This exercise, this outreach exercise, is over and above having called for written submissions by stakeholders, because organized formations are able to fly down to Cape Town, give their inputs and make recommendations in the process of lawmaking at portfolio committee level. And so they can also write up, specifically with reference to chapter and section and subsection of the law as to how it impedes or enables their operations and so on. So this outreach is really to reach out to those people who are unable, either as individuals or as part of other formations, to ensure that their voice is also heard. So it's over and above all of the access to information that the panel has, that we really want to hear them share with us their own lived experiences. So we record each and every input, and once we are done with the outreach, we will be able to organize the information properly.
Can I just say to the members of the media that we do have other panel members here, and they represent the working groups of the panel. So if you've got a specific area that you're interested in, please address it to one of them. And perhaps also, if the panel members could just give us a little soundbite on each of your particular areas for the media, that would be great.
Well, in our working group, we deal with the triple challenges of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And added to that is the question of wealth creation and distribution. The suggestions that have been coming up in fact, do highlight a very vast gap that exists between those who have access and those who do not have access to these opportunities and benefits. But what is encouraging is that people see themselves as part of the solution. They do not only raise challenges only, they do make suggestions of what are the practical actions that could be taken to respond and address the challenges that they are raising. It is a vast area which on its own would include education, health, and many others areas that relate to poverty and services that people should be getting. And what I like the most is that they are not raising theoretical questions. If on the access for health there are no facilities or a clinic only operates for 8 hours, they come and say, let the clinic operate for 24 hours. And so that is how inspiring some of the inputs that we receive are on the scope of work that is covered under Working Group 1. Thank you.
Well, the working group I chair is in charge of nation building and social cohesion. And so I'm very aware that here in Mpumalanga, the priority interest is of rural people. And here they addressed us on exclusion. So really, if you are excluded in many respects, including on major issues such as access to land, ending poverty and discrimination, then all that impacts on whether they are in a position to contribute towards nation building and cohesion. They spoke of discrimination, they spoke of exclusion, they urged us to hear the voices of rural people. They criticized us for sitting here in a city instead of going to the farm workers, for instance, who farm workers will not have the opportunity to come to us because their employers would not let them. Exclusion also includes the lack of access to information. So many people told us they can't go to Pretoria for information. Why can't information be accessed locally? And I thought, and I made a note of that. So these are all contributing factors on how the people of Mpumalanga can join in social cohesion and seeing themselves as one community. The very significant point is if you don't have food, which is what they told us is the situation of rural people. If you don't have food and you are hungry, there's very little initiative you can take towards building a nation. So everything they told us is relevant, and we have taken very careful note of it. I want to address the previous question that many people do not appear to know the law, and as a judge, I'm very aware of that. What I found interesting here is that people wanted to know their law, they wanted to know their rights, and that's why they said they want local offices here where they could access information. They don't have the resources to go to Pretoria. On the other hand, this panel, using experts, has identified all the key legislation. And so the information, the challenges, the suggestions that the community here is making will enable us to fit that under the various laws and see how changes need to be made. Thank you.
I chair the working group on land, and we're looking really at land and racial exclusion. To what extent have the land reform laws addressed the racial question? And also to what extent have they actually dealt with poverty and inequality? We've had really heartfelt submissions in all the different provinces, including even in the urban provinces, about the problems with land reform and people's perception that it's not taking place fairly or at an adequate pace. And I think what's been very interesting for us is just how extraordinarily forthright people are in giving examples, naming names, and saying this is what's going wrong and these are the officials involved or whatever. Another theme that's come out is people's concern about accountability, what to do if government doesn't deliver, and what redress they do or don't have. And also questions about budgets and you know, if there is a right to restitution or if there is a right to a labour tenants laying a claim and yet that's not being implemented, where is the budget set aside for fulfilling labour tenants' claims going to? So I think, you know, as Judge Pillay says, coming and hearing the stories on the ground really helps us to understand some of the reports that we've commissioned and some of the written submissions we've got. For example, 2 people spoke about Tenbush and problems at Tenbush, and they spoke passionately about that. And yet that's also something which we've seen in other written submissions. So one starts to get a feel of just how serious this is for people and why we need structural solutions.
I think that's it. There's no last burning question, is there? One. Okay, we'll take this last question, and that'll be a wrap.
So inside there's one gentleman who endorsed you for the presidency. I'm up for the challenge.
That is a very naughty question.
Yeah.
It's not allowed in this media briefing.
Yeah, it's not allowed. We don't mix our roles here. We are here as a panel.
Yeah.
I think he was speaking out of tenure.
With that, we'll end the briefing. Thank you very much to our esteemed panel, and thank you to the members of the media for being here.
Agitate out now.
Thing is
I'm waiting.